Thank you, Peg, and we greatly appreciate you as the 25th Annual Fall Forum Chair, as you have shaped this event for so many years. Paul, I have to say, I didn't think there was anything accidental about the Cincinnati Preservation Association, so I think you earned it. And Peg, I think you've enabled, along with all of you here, to expand the bounds of preservation and consistently brought really thoughtful speakers that we will have today. And frankly, I think you all know that if you've attended before, that this event is clearly the most impressive Cincinnati event on preservation and urban redevelopment. And that's intentional. So I'm happy that this year's speaker will continue that tradition. And additionally, today's event is part of the Arts Wave-led Power of Her initiative, which is inspired by the 150th anniversary of the women's suffragette movement. And it fits into a year-long celebration here in Cincinnati of the contributions that women have made to the arts and culture of Cincinnati. So how fitting that we will hear our speaker, Gabrielle Esperdy, who has written extensively on the experience of women in the American architecture profession from the 1950s to the present. She's an associate professor of architecture at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, and her works look at the intersection of architecture, consumerism, and modernism in urban and suburban landscapes in the United States, paying particular attention to the ways social, economic, and political issues shape the built environment. Her books include Modernizing Main Street, published in 2008, and released just this week, American Autopia, which examines how the automobile influenced architectural and urban discoveries after World War II. And as previously mentioned, her new book will be available after the luncheon in the lobby, and if you missed that, the book signing at booksellers tomorrow at 1 p.m. Esperdy's work has appeared in the Journal of Architectural Education, the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, Perspecta, and Architectural Design. She's a columnist for Places, editor of the Society of Architectural Historians, Archipedia, an online resource on the history of the built environment. How fitting that we have the opportunity to warmly welcome our speaker, Gabrielle Esperdy.
Thank you.
So glad you're here.
Thank you. Let's make sure that the microphone is in place. Well, I am delighted to have this opportunity to speak to all of you. Thank you to Paul and to Peg for the invitation and for organizing this event. It's a thrill for me to be back in Cincinnati. I've been here a number of times, but actually lived here in the early 70s in what, as I think I've told a number of you, were really formative years that taught me how to be an urban citizen. So I'm thrilled to be back, but I forgot my clicker. But I don't want to dwell in the 70s. I want to take us back to the 1940s. Because the story of the Terrace Plaza and the story that I want to tell you about women and architecture and the most modern hotel in America begins in the 1940s. We're looking here, as you can see, at an aerial view of Union Terminal taken shortly after the Great Dome was recovered in aluminum. At the time that this was finished, and it was a really big deal, it got a lot of press coverage in the Inquirer. When this was finished, it was one of the most striking modern buildings in the city. The aluminum dome itself, because of the material restrictions that had been in place during World War II, covering that great dome with aluminum was really a signal of a return to prosperity. And it was certainly an indication that Cincinnati in the post-war period was about to embark on a new era of modernization and urban redevelopment. And you can just imagine that aluminum kind of glistening in the sun. It certainly must have seemed like the most modern structure in the city. But across town, another building was just being developed, and that, of course, is the Terrace Plaza Hotel. And while it perhaps wasn't evident initially when what we were looking at was a hole in the ground, as the steel rose from this location just a block away from Fountain Square and merely a block away from where we are now, it became apparent to witnesses throughout the city that this building was not going to be like any other that the city had seen. What was also clear was that it truly was going to be the most modern hotel in America, partially because there had been no new hotels in America completed since the 1930s, and in fact, the vast majority of hotels in the United States had been completed in the 1920s, including, of course, the Netherland Plaza that we're sitting in here. So one could argue that in the aftermath of the war, in the aftermath of the privations of the Great Depression, and then, of course, the fighting the war on the home front, there was real excitement about this new building that begins to sort of make itself visible. And these are construction photographs from the Inquirer. And you can also see in the old fire insurance map, you can see the handful of buildings that were taken down to make way for the Terrace Plaza. It soon becomes clear that the building itself is going to be strikingly modern, and I think that's obvious if we compare the two buildings that are presented in these perspective drawings on promotional materials that the Emery Company produced at the time of the Terrace Plaza's completion. Obviously, they were seeing this as a sister hotel to the Netherland Plaza, but I think the differences are clear even when we're just looking at these two images, because you can see the sort of very stately, kind of still relatively sort of a Beaux-Arts classical symmetrical scheme rising up gracefully in a sort of series of podiums. We see that versus this new monolith, right, that looks like nothing more than a kind of ocean liner sort of set forth in the middle of the city. The differences are clear as well, I think, if you compare the graphics. Look at the NP up there with the sort of elaborate classical scrolling versus the sort of elegant sans serif script, TP, a sort of indication of the bristling modernity that was intended with the design of this project. When it was completed, it was celebrated as the most modern hotel in America, and you can see it was used right down there at the bottom of this advertisement that was used throughout all of the advertising for the hotel. The most modern hotel in America. It sounds like a good tagline, but in point of fact, there was something very significant about that tagline, because it indicated that something had changed, not only in American architecture, but also in American culture, that there was this particular perception after the war, after the Great Depression, that an idea of modernity, what does it mean to be a modern city, that was going to be evident everywhere you turned in this city and in others. And what's really important to stress is that Cincinnati got there first, because the completion of the Terrace Plaza Hotel, basically, while troops were still returning from the home front in 1948, is not to be sort of not taken very seriously in terms of kind of claims of, dare we say it, cultural hegemony of the Midwest relative to the cities on the coast. And we're looking here at a view of the Terrace Plaza shortly after it was completed, and I think the striking appearance that it had in the city fabric is so evident in this deliberate view that shows us the contrast with the Palace Hotel right across the street. One couldn't think of a more striking differences between the two. The one with its sort of ornate, its kind of mansard roof, its ornate stone coining, all of the sort of elaborate cornices, etc., versus that kind of sleek volume of the Terrace Plaza as it sort of rises from the street in this deliberately asymmetrical composition. One can imagine what it was like to kind of walk down the streets and see this thing literally hovering over the street. And I'll have a night view to show you in a little bit where that hovering quality will be particularly evident. But just to really think about the way that this must have looked like a harbinger of the future. Particularly what we also see in the background, of course, is Carew Tower and the Netherland Plaza. And again, you get a sense of the contrast here. Note, of course, that the Terrace Plaza, it's not a skyscraper. It's not a super tall building. It's so confident of its sort of emblematic modernity that it's just kind of hovering there on the sidewalk. I think that kind of sleek confidence is something that we can imagine as a sort of a cultural marker for the city's attitude in the post-war period. Now, the Terrace Plaza received not just local press, but national press as well. That largely had to do with the Emery's being able to kind of to catalyze their own kind of publicity network, but also because they understood that it wasn't just a building, that it was also that it was an ensemble. In the discourse of modernism, there was a lot of talk about the so-called synthesis of the arts. And that had been going on, that had been being discussed for a number of decades. But what it really meant was, how do you take architecture and art and design and sculpture and bring all of those things together in some kind of cohesive whole? Not in some rarefied way for some glorious institution that's only going to be available to a handful of people, but in something as commercial and public as a hotel. And I think we tend to forget the way that the role that hotels played in the United States and in European cities as well in the middle of the 20th century. These really were understood as public gathering places. Ones that, in the case of the Terrace Plaza, the sort of idea of inviting the public in was evident in the restaurants that were available, which went from kind of the basement all the way up to the roof in sort of, let's say, in a very obvious socioeconomic hierarchy, because the cheapest restaurant was in the basement and the most expensive one was on the roof. But nonetheless, what was clear is that everyone, in a sense, could come into the Terrace Plaza and participate in the sort of modernity that was on display there. At least one should say within limits, given the sort of realities, the socioeconomic realities of racial politics in America in the middle of the 20th century. So one shouldn't kind of gloss over that. But in terms of the press coverage, what was being presented was this building that was like none other that had been seen in the United States. It was described as radically new and emblematic of modernity. And that's evident as well in the, of course, in the art that was included here, the Owens Merrill mural that, of course, along with the Saul Steinberg one and the Alexander Calder sculpture are now all in the Cincinnati Museum. So we can go and visit those and really get a sense of what a complete ensemble this must have been when it appeared. Now, as all of this kind of lavish press coverage was appearing in the Midwest and in New York papers as well, there was no mention at all of the person who was who was principally responsible for the design of the hotel. Her name was Natalie de Blois. At that point, she was a very young associate in the firm of Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill, who themselves had only been around for about a decade. Now, SOM, as we generally refer to them, SOM would go on to become one of the leading architecture firms of the United States in the second half of the 20th century. They would almost single-handedly define what we think of as kind of corporate modernism in America. And they, of course, continue to be an extremely vital global architecture firm at this point. I mean, today. But at that point, they were still young and up and coming. And again, as many of you probably know, they received the commission not because they had vast hotel experience, but because precisely they did not have any hotel experience. But they had ideas. And they had also fully committed themselves to the idea of modern architecture and planning. And so had young Natalie de Blois, who when she began working on this project was only about 25 years old. So she's very young, she's relatively out of school, and she is, as it turns out, designing a building that is being heralded, her first major project is being heralded as a game changer in terms of American architecture and American urbanism. Now, Natalie, of course, was not the first woman to design hotels in the United States. We can go back to earlier in the 20th century to the work of Louise Blanchard Bethune, who is usually regarded as the first professional architect, the first woman to be a professional architect in the United States. She was the first female member of the American Institute of Architects. She was responsible for hundreds of buildings in upstate New York, in Buffalo, and then kind of extending across the Midwest. We're just looking at one of her hotels, the Lafayette Hotel, which was one of the largest hotels in the United States when it opened, with some 200 rooms. It still stands today in the center of Buffalo, and has recently been refurbished. Slightly later, kind of beginning to overlap with Natalie's sort of adolescent sphere, if not her professional sphere, is the work of Mary Jane Coulter. Mary Jane Coulter practiced principally in the Southwest, and she, for more than 30 years, she was the chief architect and designer of the Fred Harvey Company. And that, of course, was the company that had the concession to run hotels and restaurants along all of the railway lines that went basically across the American Southwest. So from that position, she was responsible for at least 50 hotels and probably hundreds of tea rooms, et cetera. So although one could argue there were these professional precedents of a woman being engaged in the design of hotels, none of this, Natalie would not have been aware of any of this when she was a young girl growing up first in Paterson, New Jersey, and then very soon after that, she moved to the more prosperous suburb of Ridgewood, and these are just contemporary views of Ridgewood. Today, as it was then, it's very much a kind of railroad suburb of New York City. By all accounts, Natalie had a happy, kind of prosperous childhood. Interestingly, although Ridgewood is a very easy train ride from New Jersey to Manhattan, she recalls going to New York only rarely. In the oral histories that were done with her. But she did recall 2 times that left an impression. One was a visit to St. John the Divine on the Upper West Side of Manhattan to see an exhibition that had funding from the federal government but was principally put on by the New York City Housing Authority, in which they built a full-scale replica of a tenement dwelling in the side aisle of the church. She recalled that left a profound impression on her. Not that she necessarily became involved in kind of social equity architecture, as we might describe it today, but what she began to realize was the power of the design of buildings to transform the way people lived. Equally influential by her recollections was her visit to the 1939 World's Fair being held in Flushing Meadow in Queens in 1939 and in 1940. Now, obviously, modernism was everywhere in the world of tomorrow as the 1939 World's Fair was billed. At the fair, she would undoubtedly have seen, though probably not understood the significance of, buildings like these, including the Venezuela Pavilion that was designed by Skidmore, Owens Merrill, her future employers. They not only did the master plan for the 1939 World's Fair, but they were also responsible for about 8 pavilions scattered throughout the exhibition. She might also have seen, and I'm sure there would have been no way she could have missed it, the New York City Pavilion that would eventually prove significant in her professional career, as we'll see in a moment, and that's the New York State Pavilion, the New York City Pavilion on the top there. It's today the Queens Museum, one of the few, actually the only building from the 39 fair that is still extant. So, having gone to St. John the Divine and seen that tenement model, having gone to the World's Fair, Natalie remained convinced that she really wanted to study architecture. And that was something that her father wholeheartedly supported. He was an engineer by training, and apparently early on he realized that Natalie had a kind of proficiency, not just with say, mathematics and calculation, but also as a visual stylist, you might say, with respect to her drawing. And so he fully supported her desire to go to college to study architecture. But because of the effects of the Depression, although her family was solidly middle class, her parents insisted that they could own that she and her siblings had to secure scholarships for their college studies. And the place that she was able to secure a scholarship to attend was the Western College for Women that's now a part of Miami University. But in deciding to go to school there, and I'm actually just showing you some of the buildings, and also the Tree Day celebrations that apparently took place at Western College for Women kind of right up until the 1960s. So although I don't have any images of Natalie participating in a tree event, we can assume that she too would have donned a flowy robe and danced around an elm or something like that. But in spending time studying at Western, she wasn't actually delaying her architectural education, because most architecture schools that she was interested, particularly MIT, which was where her father had gone, they required all students to have 2 years of sort of basic college-level classes before they would admit them into the architecture program. But then the war happened. And while she was still studying in Ohio, she discovered that Columbia had changed its entrance requirements because of the number of men who were leaving their college studies because of the draft after the U.S. entered the war. They had decided to let students with only 1 year of college experience come and study architecture at Columbia. So Natalie came back east, enrolled at Columbia, and then completed her studies there in 1944. While she was there, although it's not clear that she was on scholarship, she did work in a number of different places in order to support herself while she completed her architectural studies, including offering manual drafting classes for young soldiers who were about to join the Army Corps of Engineers and other military occupations. Columbia had accepted women into the architecture school by the time Natalie got there for probably about 3 decades, but their numbers were still very, very small. When she graduated with the class of 1944, there were 5 women in her class of 18. So clearly their numbers were beginning to change, largely due to the fact of the war that was taking place. Also, while she was at Columbia, she supported herself doing mechanical drawings for Babcock and Willis boilers, and even more significantly, she began working in the studio of Friedrich Kiesler, who was an Austrian immigrant, who was a kind of leading voice for modern art and design in the United States in the 1940s. He, in addition to designing a number of very important interiors and publishing books, he's perhaps best known as the designer of Peggy Guggenheim's Art of This Century gallery, and we see images of that here. And Natalie was in his office when this was being produced. So Natalie graduates with distinction from Columbia. She wins a number of awards, and her director actually recommends her for her first job. And she gets hired immediately, working for the firm of Ketchum, Gina, and Sharp. Now, Ketchum, Gina, and Sharp are probably not designers you've heard of, but in the 1940s, they were responsible for some of the boldest, most modern retail design that was happening in the United States. So she throws herself into this work. She throws herself into the kind of social whirlwind of life in New York in the sort of immediate post-war period. By all accounts, she was very satisfied with this kind of work, working on a variety of retail interiors, as well as kind of early prefabrication prototypes of the sort that Ketchum, Gina, and Sharp did with the storefront manufacturer Conair. While she was at Ketchum, Gina, and Sharp, she confronted what she later described as her first shock. She was happily employed there, had been there for about 8 months, when one of her male colleagues made what she would later describe as kind of inappropriate advances. She rebuffed him on a number of occasions. He, as one would not be surprised to learn, would not take no for an answer, and then went and complained to Morris Ketchum that Natalie's presence in the drafting room was a distraction and that it was bad for morale, et cetera, et cetera. Natalie was, as she recalled, shocked that this would have happened. They had been colleagues. Her work was admired. She had no intention of leaving, but she was dismissed without so much as any questions asked. But Morris Ketchum did one thing. He called his friend Louis Skidmore, and he said, okay, I got to let this woman go. Well, I'm sure he didn't call her a woman. I'm sure he said, I've got this girl here. You should hire her. So sort of a kind of, one could describe as a kind of brutal confrontation with sexism ends up changing her professional career. As Louis Skidmore hires her instantly and puts her to work. And just Louis Skidmore again, and just to give you some sense of SOM work kind of in this period, this is Toffanetti's in Times Square that they completed in 1940, and this is a view of the Toffanetti's on VE Day in 1945. So they're still at this point a kind of a young firm, as I've already indicated, but they are starting to have work in the office. One of the first projects that Natalie works on is to renovate the interiors of the New York City Pavilion from the 1939 World's Fair in order to redeploy that building for use by the United Nations while their new headquarters are rising on the East River in Manhattan. And so it was basically an interior redesign job. Natalie was responsible for much of the detailing and was also responsible for the podium and the kind of extended desks that you see in these views. So here she is, basically 25 years old, and we're looking at Harry Truman here addressing what would have been the second UN General Assembly ever, but the first one to take place in New York. This was Natalie's work that ended up on the front page of newspapers around the globe at the very young age of 24, even though, of course, she's uncredited, but nonetheless, it must have been a heady experience. And then, of course, her next project, no sooner is the UN work finished, her next project is to begin work on the Terrace Plaza. Now, the commission had been in the office for probably about 18 months. Some schematic and massing studies had already been done, but it really fell to Natalie to execute the design of this building. At this point, she would never have gotten such an opportunity. But SOM's lead designer and only design partner at that point, Gordon Bunshaft, was still away completing his time in the military. So in Gordon's absence, Natalie steps in. Again, she's very young. She steps in to work on what is now one of the biggest commissions that SOM has in the office. And I want to return now to this notion that this building, when it was finished, was described as radically new and kind of the most modern hotel in America, and just spend a moment to consider what that really meant in this context of the 1940s, now that we've seen a kind of evolution of both the profession and of say, Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill. We're looking at that at a postcard view of the Terrace Plaza at night, and this is where you really can see the way that the glass that was originally in the building would have really glowed at night. And of course, as many of you know, some of the glass panels just above the storefront have since been removed and they've been covered over. So it appears more monolithic than it did originally. One of the things that made the Terrace Plaza so quote-unquote radically new was the fact that the ground floor was retail. Then there were two department stores in the kind of elevated monolithic block, and that provided the base for the hotel that rose above it. And you can see it both in the image and in the kind of exploded axonometric. You can see the mass of the hotel slab rising there. What that meant was that when you entered the Terrace Plaza to go to the hotel, you entered through that extended canopy, which we see down here, kind of that lovely cantilever with the letters standing up in silhouette. So as you're walking down the sidewalk, it's kind of unmistakable that you're going to be invited in. You kind of walk to those glass doors that we see there, walk through them kind of seamlessly. I think we underestimate the significance of glass doors, full glass doors that had nothing but a slim aluminum frame around them. We underestimate how modern those must have been, and what those did to kind of to minimize the distinction between the sort of right-of-way of the public sidewalk and then somehow being inside this new and modern space. So we're sort of invited in to the sort of entrance vestibule of the Terrace Plaza, where we confront a bank of express elevators that are going to take us up to the 8th floor where we will encounter the lobby. Now this act alone, in addition to the rooftop restaurant, a number of other features that were included in the building, the idea of putting the hotel itself suspended over this retail block with a lobby on the 8th floor, elevated above the urban fabric of the city, that was radically new. But I would argue that it's not entirely without precedent. I think that when we put Natalie's accomplishments at when we look at Natalie's accomplishments at the Terrace Plaza, and they are many, but it's important to put them into the context of what was happening in American architecture at the time. And I want to just sort of mention one building that I think is critical here. This is the Philadelphia Savings Fund Society building, the PSFS building in Philadelphia that was designed by William Lescaz and George Howe and completed in 1932. The massing is not unlike that of the Terrace Plaza Hotel. In many respects, this building can be understood as the most critical American building to respond to the precepts of European modernism. So this was the building that said, oh, okay, I get what those modernists over there, I get what Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius are trying to do. This is my response. It was a mixed-use building. It was an office tower, it had a retail bank, and then it had stores on the lower level. It also had that great curving shell, not unlike the sort of department store block at Terrace Plaza. Even more important, you did not enter the banking hall, and again, this was meant to be your branch bank. You did not enter it from the street. At the time, in 1932, this was seen to be a radical kind of programmatic choice. So here we are in this series of color images. It's since been turned into a hotel. How ironic! The office tower is now a hotel. But we're standing there on the corner. You can just make out the sort of PSFS sign there. Here it is on street level. You would walk through the doors, and what you would encounter was a set of escalators and a set of stairs that would take you to the elevated banking hall. So in other words, if you had to conduct your bank business, you were already kind of entering into, let's call it the spectacle of the modern building, as you left the city street and went upstairs. Natalie would have known this building, and as would Louis Skidmore, because it was very well published. And I think they probably took the lessons of the PSFS building to heart, which also, I think, are evident in the material choices that we find at the Terrace Plaza, and also in the sort of decidedly asymmetrical massing of the building as a whole. And here, of course, is the Terrace Plaza, and we can see the way some of those comparable design choices end up being resolved. I think the placement of those oversized letters on the buildings, kind of at the building's roofline, that's clearly a response to the PSFS building. That was widely noted at the time. That as the urban fabric of American cities grew, to embrace more ideas about the sort of occupying vertical space, that the notion of putting a sign way up on the top of the building was something that needed to be taken into account. So we see her placing the Terrace Plaza sign there. Again, the cantilever of the entrance we've already discussed, and then of course one of the most striking elements of the Terrace Plaza, the restaurant on the top, kind of that hovers very lightly on the roof of that building. According to Natalie's oral history, Louis Skidmore said, okay, I think we're going to put the restaurant up there. Give me a couple different sketches. And so she came up with a number of different solutions, all of which required this small module-like element literally seeming to hover on the roof, and not just hover, but as I think you can tell in the larger views, you just have a slight indication of it as you're walking down the sidewalk. You can kind of glimpse up, and it's just sort of over there peeking out. As if it's kind of suspended there, and people at the time talked about perhaps it, looking as if it might take off at any moment. Now, that's clearly Natalie responding to certain precepts of modernism, in which, let's call it a kind of sculptural approach to the design of programmatic elements. So, and by programmatic elements, right, the slab of the rooms, the kind of sculptural element of the restaurant. Each of those are considered as if the whole thing is a vast three-dimensional sculpture, and she's kind of arranging all of those elements in response to their function, but also very clearly in response to whether or not the whole thing is a kind of pleasing synthetic composition. Now, one other point I want to make with respect to the Terrace Plaza is that this building is not some kind of one-off that is important, say, to the urban fabric of Cincinnati, and maybe, yes, is important because it was the first modern hotel in America. But in fact, I think it's very clear the influence that the Terrace Plaza had, certainly on the man who became the leading designer of modern hotels in the United States, Morris Lapidus, who, if you may not know, was also involved in the design of the Terrace Plaza because he was working for the Bond clothing store at this point and was responsible for the interiors of the Bond store. So Lapidus was undoubtedly familiar with the SOM scheme for Terrace Plaza, and just looking at a handful of his projects, including most famously the Fontainebleau in Miami Beach, and then the rest of them in New York, I think you can very clearly see the way he's responding to Natalie's solution in that project of the earlier decade, particularly in the case of the Americana and the Sheraton Motor Lodge. This is now the Chinese consulate, in case any of you are wondering why the glass is weird and whatnot. The sort of hovering module on the roof. So just to point out that the Terrace Plaza fits into an important line of American modernism, and so while it's important to trace its precedent, it's also important to think about its influence. Now, Natalie, once work is completed on the Terrace Plaza, which I think is fair to say we could also sort of understand as being perhaps having a hint of what we could call her second shock, because she never came to Cincinnati while she was working on the project. And again, it's not clear if no one came or if she simply wasn't sent because she was too junior and perhaps also because she was a woman. We know that in fact did have an impact on her ability to carry out her duties while she was in New York, because frequently contractors and other people involved in the design of the Terrace Plaza would come into SOM's New York office, and then they would continue the meetings over lunch, which were generally at clubs where women were excluded. And so she would basically be told, okay, we'll be back at 2, make sure you're back at 2. Meanwhile, they would kind of go off and have their meetings, make all sorts of decisions without, in fact, consulting the person who was the lead designer for the project. So nonetheless, Natalie soldiers on, if you will, and spends the next decade and a half working on some of the buildings for which Skidmore, Owens Merrill have become justly famous. She and Gordon Bunshaft kind of worked together as kind of design partners in all of these projects, including things that are as iconic as the Lever House, that I think both in its massing and in its finishes very clearly shows that Natalie had absorbed the lessons of the Terrace Plaza and deployed them in this building and in others, as we'll see, including her own next hotel. This is Skidmore, Owens & Merrill's design for the Istanbul Hilton, which at the time was the most modern hotel in Turkey, and by many accounts the most modern hotel in Europe at the time. Again, many of the same features that we find in the Terrace Plaza, not the elevated block of the rooms, but the other features with respect to the sort of scaling of social spaces and the kind of incorporation of modern art and design throughout, we also find here. Natalie played an important role in the design of the Connecticut General Headquarters, one of the most celebrated of the post-war suburban corporate campuses. Again, many of the same issues, this kind of incorporation of courtyards and roof terraces and a kind of real orchestration of art and design and interiors that reflect her ongoing commitment to modernism and to modern design. And then perhaps the building for which she is best known, this small kind of jewel-like PepsiCo headquarters, which still stands on Park Avenue, and is just a sort of testament to the true possibilities of corporate modernism in terms of adding a kind of being an ornament to the post-war city. But she was also the senior designer on astonishingly large projects like this. This is the Union Carbide building, also known as 270 Park, that will probably become the building for which she is best known, principally because, as we speak, J.P. Morgan Chase is in the midst of demolishing this building in what is the largest voluntary demolition of a building apparently in the history of the world. So they are taking this down to build a building that is 5 stories taller. I don't want to get political, but let's just call this Jamie Dimon's vanity project. And you can quote me on that. So again, but while Natalie is working on all of these buildings, she is, by all accounts, relatively satisfied with her work. And she is also, to an extent, acknowledged. This is just two examples of the degree to which she is acknowledged. This is a small feature in Fortune magazine in which she and her colleague William Brown are called out, if you will, as those who are responsible for the design of this magazine. So her contributions are not unknown. She appears on an episode of To Tell the Truth, in which the guests have to figure out which one of the 3 women is the architect. It's really not that hard to tell because the other 2 women have trouble naming even one architect when they're asked, like, so who's your favorite architect, kind of thing. She's receiving professional accolades, but it also eventually occurs to her that she's not being promoted either. And it's in this period, after kind of frustrations with her lack of professional progress, she decides to leave New York. Bruce Graham, the head of SOM's Chicago office, invites her to come there, says she'll have a free hand, offers her a kind of flexible schedule that is important because at this point she's divorced from her husband and is a single mother and has kind of a sort of complex life dealing with raising her children while also working full time. But she leaves the New York office and she says her recollection, no one really even pays attention or notes that she's gone. She's in Chicago for a number of years until she will eventually depart there and move on to Texas. But it is while she's in Chicago, clearly reflecting on her lack of professional advancement, because it should be noted, when she goes to Chicago, it's not as if she becomes a partner or even an associate partner. She remains a senior designer. And with respect to the kind of professional hierarchy of architecture, that's actually significant. That despite her accomplishments, she never received the title and, in some ways, the equity in the firm that went along with that. So it's during this period that she becomes involved with the early movement of feminist activism in the architecture profession. She's one of the founding members of Chicago Women in Architecture, which emerges initially simply as a support group. In the 70s, Natalie reflected, along with a number of others, that it was so, what a relief it was to simply be in the same room sharing all the same stories about your professional successes and your potentially lack of advancement. It's her involvement in the Chicago Women in Architecture that leads to her further engagement in these issues when she joins the AIA Women and Minorities Subcommittee, and she serves on that in the middle of the 1970s. That's a much longer story that has to do with this kind of the success of a generation of women serving as activists within the profession. And this is actually the resolution that is passed on the status of women. And part of that resolution is that the AIA as an institution is now going to investigate and issue a regular report on the status of women, and then by 74, it's the Women and Minorities Subcommittee. So she remains kind of active, thinking about the role of women in architecture. And at this time is also, again, as part of this this kind of bubbling, the way that feminist activism is bubbling into the architecture profession and also into architectural history, she comes to be increasingly recognized. This was a spread and installation shots from Susana Torres' Women in American Architecture. It was a touring exhibition that was groundbreaking in terms of going kind of historically and recognizing that women have been shapers of the built environment for far longer than anyone had realized. And you can see Natalie's two-page spread in that catalog. Again, featured in an Ada Louise Huxtable review. This is a real estate review. Ada Louise Huxtable, the formidable architecture critic of the New York Times, would also write about her. But so you can see that Natalie is getting some professional regard by the late 1970s. That's also around the time that she decides that she's going to leave SOM. There's been no professional advancement. An old SOM colleague invites her to come down to Texas and to basically be in the firm however she wants to be. She works exclusively on high-rise buildings. She also begins teaching, which she recollected was some of her most satisfying professional experiences, and we see her here teaching a skyscraper studio at UT Austin. She would teach on and off at UT Austin until she eventually retired, and although it happened after her death, there is now a scholarship at UT Austin called the Natalie de Blois Scholarship that supports advanced work by women who are architecture students at the school. So what we've seen today is Natalie de Blois emerging as someone who was given a degree of credit while the work was underway in the 40s and 50s and 60s, but nonetheless needed to be, in effect, rediscovered. And that happens at the very beginning of this century when she participates in a singularly important oral history project that is done out of Chicago, and the transcripts of those are all online. It's an amazing resource. And also there's another quite detailed interview that Detlef Mertens did with her in 2006, which is also available online. So she begins to get the sort of professional recognition that she deserves, and then perhaps most significantly, Sean Patrick Tubb invites her to Cincinnati while he's doing research on the Terrace Plaza, invites her to Cincinnati to see the Terrace Plaza. And so a few years before her death, she's actually able to visit the building that she had been involved in so significantly. I was going to end with this image because, well, it's so romantic, right? Here's the designer, after all her travails, eventually seeing the building that has brought her such acclaim. But then I thought, let me end with this one. This is the view of the Terrace Plaza today, out of my hotel room on the 27th floor of the Netherland Plaza. Much less romantic, no? I mean, even if we find poetry in ruins, I think I'll leave you with this image, because after all, we are here to talk about preservation in Cincinnati. So while that kind of gets fixed in your mind, I will say thank you very much for this opportunity, and if we have time, I'm happy to entertain any questions.